Welcome to the Algebra of Tyrants, Democracy in Ruins. This presentation proposes that democratic nations in societal distress are in danger of devolving from functional democratic norms and institutions towards a more chaotic governance environment, and then perhaps all the way to an autocracy, and that transition can occur quite rapidly. The brief will present an analytical framework that captures the key elements of this danger and uses it to perform a comparative analysis between the rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany between 1920 and 1935 and the continuing rise of Donald Trump in America 2015 to 2024 and potentially beyond. Simply said, the comparison is striking. Although there is a difference in degree, you will see that the state of distress in Germany in the 1920s and the USA between 2009 and 2024 are similar. In these distressed contexts, a century apart, we will review the actions and consequences of Hitler's Nazi regime and Trump's MAGA movement. The ramifications of the similarities in worldview and political approach of these two leaders should be chilling. As author of this brief, it is my hope that the audience will recognize the extreme warning signs in play and use this awareness to make their vote stand as a beacon of hope for the preservation and healing of our democracy. Okay, first we provide a description of our comparative framework. It is presented as a mathematical formula with three terms that when added together can have a significant influence on the decline of a nation's democracy. The first term is the level of societal distress as measured by social, political, and economic distress indices. A high level of societal distress creates instability and dissatisfaction among the populace that can be exploited by bad actors. The second term provides that bad actor, a leader with some level of tyrannical tendencies and the willingness and capability to take meaningful actions to weaken democratic norms and institutions. The third term represents a roadmap of tactics that have been executed historically by tyrants with the goals of stirring civil strife and eventually taking autocratic control of a nation. I call this the tyrant's roadmap. Its purpose includes creating societal division, suppressing dissent, manipulating institutions, and eliminating democratic guardrails. Where there is simultaneous presence of a nation in distress and a strongman leader with tyrannical intentions, any actions taken in alignment with the tyrant's roadmap can move to weaken democracy to a point where there is civil strife, perhaps even civil war, and eventually towards autocratic authoritarianism. Okay, let's look at the first term in our equation, societal distress. It consists of three components: social distress, political distress, and economic distress. Social distress is an aggregate of measures, including racial and ethnic division, ideological polarization, accessibility of weapons, and violent acts. The second component, political distress, is measured by an authoritative index called the Polity Index. At the top of the scale is a full democracy with working institutions and norms. At the bottom of the scale is an autocracy, where there is a single leader that rules without effective or constitutional limitations. And in the middle is an anocracy. Democratic processes exist, but are flawed and are not fully functional. In many cases, the anocracy is the most dangerous point along this scale. Economic distress can be made up of many measures. In looking at the USA and its level of economic distress, we focus on wealth inequality and income inequality and daily standard of living. In Germany, we looked at the level of economic activity, labor market health, price stability, fiscal stability, and financial sector health. When two or more of these components are considered under high distress, this creates a fertile ground for an authoritarian leader to rise. Let's describe the tyrant, the bad actor in this equation. For the purpose of this brief, we will define a tyrant as an autocratic ruler who governs or desires to govern through fear, oppression, and absolute power. Common characteristics of a tyrant include absolute power, oppression, arbitrary rule, lack of legitimacy, corruption, suppression of freedoms, and a cult of personality. Such leaders can dismantle democratic institutions, suppress opposition, and centralize power, fundamentally altering the nation's democratic character. Let's describe a tyrant's tactics. There are a set of tactics that tyrants can execute through various actions that will serve their objectives of causing societal chaos and to advance more autocratic rule for their regime. Examples of the use of these tactics can be found throughout history. I call this menu of 9 tactics the tyrant's roadmap. A description of the first 5 of these roadmap tactics is shown in the slide, and we will focus on each tactic's intended results. We start with populist rhetoric and charisma. This is about gaining broad-based support by exploiting public dissatisfaction and creating a sense of identity around the tyrant's vision. This helps in rallying support and marginalizing opposition. The second is scapegoating and division. This is to unify the leader's base, distract from real issues, and justify repressive measures against those identified as threats. The third is attack on democratic institutions. Here, the intended result is to erode trust in these institutions, allowing the leader to bypass or control them, thus consolidating power and limiting accountability. Centralization of power. This is to eliminate obstacles to the leader's authority and create a system where they have unchecked power. And manipulation of information. This is to shape public perception, suppress dissent, and create an environment where the leader's version of reality is the only accepted truth. These tactics help the tyrant solidify a base, create a division between his base and his opposition, erode trust in institutions, and control the narrative with his vision of truth. There are 4 more tactics to be explored. First, legal manipulation and repression. Here, the result intended is to create a legal framework that supports authoritarian rule and suppresses opposition under the guise of legality. Cult of personality. This is about building loyalty and discouraging dissent, creating a narrative where the leader is seen as essential to the nation's success or even survival. Use of force and intimidation. The intended result is to eliminate threats, enforce compliance, and create an environment where dissent is dangerous or futile. And finally, erosion of democratic norms. Here, the tyrant wants to create a political environment where their actions are not constrained by democratic principles, allowing them to exercise power without opposition or accountability. These 9 tactics, taken together, are to ensure the tyrant's hold on power. This slide describes the range of governance models that should be considered when evaluating a nation's democratic health. It is based on the polity scale. The polity scale assigns a score on a scale of -10 to +10, with -10 representing a hereditary monarchy, a full autocracy, and +10 representing a consolidated democracy. The scale is based upon evaluating the authority characteristics of the nation, examining aspects such as executive recruitment, and constraints on executive authority and political competition. When a nation is at a crossroad of societal distress, plus the presence of a leader with tyrannical intentions, plus the availability of a political machine to execute the tyrant's roadmap, there will be a force that favors transitions towards more chaotic forms of governance and eventually to a well-controlled autocracy. A fully consolidated democracy is difficult to move off its foundation. But if you start with a struggling democracy, these cracks can be exploited. As you will see, when Hitler emerged, the Weimar Republic in Germany was clearly at least a struggling democracy, and it was toppled rapidly. You will see that for the first time since our 1861 Civil War, the USA became rated as a struggling democracy or even an anocracy during Trump's presidential term. Let's review the possible transitions in the governance models. A struggling democracy experiences eroding performance and constraints offered by democratic institutions and norms. It can transition to an anocracy or directly to an autocracy. An anocracy is marked by weak institutions and high political instability, typically blending democratic and autocratic features. This is a particularly dangerous governance model, as those with more democratic than autocratic features are actually twice as likely as autocracies to experience political instability or civil war, and 3 times as likely as a struggling democracy. Finally, an autocracy concentrates power in a single ruler or a small elite, with limited political freedoms and little accountability. Hitler was able to move Germany from a struggling democracy directly to a full autocracy in just 2 years. In the slides that follow, there is a comparison of the rise and rule of Adolf Hitler and Donald Trump. They exist in a different time in history, a century apart, but the similarity of their ideals and actions are striking to the most casual observer who is willing to see. Both leaders exploited social, political, and economic distress to undermine democracy and consolidate power. Hitler's actions from 1933 to 1935 and Trump's actions from 2015 to 2024 and potentially beyond demonstrate similar tactics and tragic outcomes. This comparison should not be ignored in deciding how to vote in 2024. So let's take a look at the details for each of these tyrants. Hitler's tyrannical algebra. This slide presents a high-level overview of the key elements that led to the loss of Germany's democracy between 1933 and 1935. We can see trends and disruptions in societal distress measures that set the context for the rapid transformation of Hitler from just the head of the Nazi Party to chancellor, then president, then autocratic tyrant. We also see that Hitler checked every box on the roadmap of tyrannical actions to realize and then cement his autocratic takeover. Let's look at some of the details. Here we look at the details of Germany's societal distress in the years 1920 to 1932. When looking at the contributors of societal distress in this time period, there's no clear singular trend. Instead, there are events of significant disruption throughout the time period of Hitler's rise. Some are external to the rise of Nazism, and some are directly exacerbated by Hitler's actions and those of the Nazi apparatus. Some of these disruptions can best be characterized as continuous societal volatility. Looking at social distress, the diagram on the left, it was continuously moderate to high in the aftermath of World War I, with a sudden move to high distress between 1928 and 1932 when Hitler took control as president. The following driving factors characterize the reason for this sudden move. Increasing racial ethnic division via the rise in Nazi influence and increasing anti-Semitism. Increasing ideological polarization. This is due to increased Nazi electoral successes. Increasing accessibility of weapons because of increased militarization and Nazi paramilitaries. And increasing violent acts due to high levels of political violence between the Nazis and communists. Looking at political distress, the center diagram, the Polity Index judged Germany as a weak democracy due to the lack of governmental stability or stable political culture and attacks on civil liberties. Disillusioned German citizens longed for something better and through their voting gave the Nazis enough power to take over. They got something tremendously worse, a full autocracy by 1935. Now looking at economic distress. First, because of World War I and post-war recovery issues and hyperinflation, there was extreme economic distress until 1924. This was followed by a short period of stabilization between 1924 and 1929 due to the Dawes Plan and currency stabilization actions taken by Germany. But alas, the Great Depression hit, leading to a sharp decline in international trade and investment in Germany, credit withdrawal by American banks to Germany, and soaring unemployment rates. The dire economic situation further inflamed social divisions and political instability. Each component of societal stress shows a significant disruption between 1928 and 1935. This presented a fertile ground for anybody offering something different. Unfortunately, Hitler was that leader. A quick aside on this slide. One pivotal moment occurred in the rise of Hitler needs to be told because of its reflection in the rise of Donald Trump. In 1923, Hitler orchestrated the Beer Hall Putsch, an attempted coup in Munich to overthrow the Weimar Republic, which was the democratic government established by Germany in 1919. The coup failed. Hitler was arrested and after a trial sentenced to prison where he writes Mein Kampf, translated to My Struggle. In Mein Kampf, he lays out his political leadership philosophy. Before that event, however, the trial gave Hitler and his ideas unprecedented exposure across Germany. Media coverage of the trial allowed him to broadcast his nationalistic and anti-Weimar sentiments to a wider audience. Hitler portrayed himself and his co-conspirators as patriots fighting for Germany's future, framing the coup as an act of national salvation rather than a criminal act. This helped him gain sympathy and support for those disillusioned with the Weimar Republic. The reflection in the Trump timeline shows a strikingly similar strategy of using the criminal indictments made against Trump and his co-conspirators after the January 6, 2021 insurrection. Here is a recounting of Hitler's execution of the tyrant's roadmap tactics that he used so effectively in his rise to power. As noted above, he checked every box in the table. He used his powerful oratory skills to invoke strong populist, nationalist, and anti-Semitic sentiments, and to portray himself as the only person that can restore former glory for Germany after the Treaty of Versailles. He scapegoated Jews and communists to sow societal division and hatred. He attacked important democratic institutions by undermining the judiciary and controlling the message and the press. He centralized power via the Enabling Act, which gave him dictatorial powers. He was able to make law without the legislature, and merging the offices of Chancellor and President to become the singular leader, the Führer. He manipulated information through a propaganda machine that held no accountability to truth and censoring dissenting opinions, often with violence. He manipulated the legal system. The Reichstag fire decree suspended civil liberties, and the Gestapo was used to silence and eliminate opposition. He was a master at building a cult of personality around his leadership via rallies, parades, and films depicting him as the savior of Germany, especially with young people. Force and intimidation were carried out by paramilitary groups to enforce his rule. Finally, he eroded the norm of mutual respect across different demographics and ignored checks and balances until he finally eliminated them altogether. Trump's tyrannical algebra. This slide presents a high-level overview of the key elements that has led to the degradation of America's democracy to the very dangerous state of anocracy between 2015 and 2020, and portends a potential slide into autocracy after 2024 with a Trump re-election. We can see trends and disruptions in societal distress measures that set the context for the surprising and rapid rise to power of Donald Trump. We also see that Trump's use of the tyrannical roadmap tactics is almost as complete as Hitler's. Where his attempt to centralize power via an insurrection in 2021 was the only failure in implementing the roadmap, one must ask if he will fail again if he is reelected in 2024. Let's look at the Trump details. America's Societal Distress, 2009 to 2024. When looking at the contributors of societal distress in this time period, we see that the social distress was increasing continuously to the present day. We see that political distress took a major hit starting in 2015 to 2020. Here, our democracy weakened to its lowest point since before the Civil War in 1861. Economic distress has been generally high since the Great Recession of 2009, but with slight continuous improvements. Now looking at the details, with regard to social distress, USA is experiencing increasing social distress. The driving factors: racial and ethnic division. These are due to the racial backlash after the Obama election, and this accelerated in the Trump years due to his embracing of white nationalism and demonization of Muslims and immigrants. Ideological polarization. This is due to the expansion of the culture wars across many issues: abortion, secularism, and gay marriage. Accessibility of weapons. Increasing ownership and easy availability of weapons of war are key factors. And finally, violent acts. Hate crimes are increasing. Now looking at political distress. The USA is now a weakening democracy. The driving factors include the decline of civil behavior. This undermines societal cohesion and stability. The bypassing of democratic norms. This leads to the weakening of democratic institutions and incidents of corruption. Disinformation and leadership failures. And this causes decline in trust in government and media. This declining trust creates a vacuum that can be exploited and lead to extremist movements and heightened conflict. And finally, economic distress. The USA is hovering near high to severe economic distress. The driving factors: income and wealth inequality. Here, high levels indicate economic distress and social instability, as well as lack of economic mobility. And finally, unavailability of affordable housing and inflation. This degrades the daily standard of living. Now, here is a recounting of Trump's execution of the tyrant's roadmap tactics. As noted above, the one tactic where Trump failed, at least so far, was in centralization of power. But as we review Trump's execution of the roadmap, let's remind ourselves of the similar actions of Hitler. Just as Hitler used his powerful oratory skills to invoke strong populist and nationalist and anti-Semitic sentiments, and to portray himself as the only person that can restore the former glory of Germany after the Treaty of Versailles, Trump vilified immigrants, Muslims, and the so-called elite, and established the Make America Great Again movement as the only road to addressing the grievances of his political base. Just as Hitler scapegoated Jews, Trump has scapegoated immigrants to create an us versus them mentality. Just as Hitler attacked important democratic institutions by undermining the judiciary and controlling the message and the press, Trump criticized judges and questioned the legitimacy of the court, and called all news outlets except those favorable to him fake news. Hitler centralized power via the Enabling Act, which gave him dictatorial powers. Trump attempted and continues to say he will use the DOJ against his political foes. He also resisted the oversight role of Congress, refusing to comply with subpoenas, and tried to overturn the election of 2020 with an insurrection. And we would be remiss if we did not acknowledge Project 2025, which calls for extremist extensions to executive power. Just as Hitler manipulated information through a propaganda machine that held no accountability to truth, Trump has used and manipulated the landscape of social media to largely disinform the American public through persistent lying. He lied over 30,000 times during his presidential term. Just as Hitler manipulated the legal system to suspend civil liberties, Trump was able to stack the Supreme Court to create immunity from criminal prosecution of his own actions to suppress civil liberties. The Voting Act, women's reproductive rights, protection of corporations from ruining the common environment. Just as Hitler was a master of building a cult of personality around his leadership, Trump and his movement to create a base of support who are all in believing everything he says regardless of real facts, and that only he is the singular leader that can save America from the grievances they hold. Again, despite the facts of his abysmal presidential record. Just as Hitler used force and intimidation by paramilitary groups to enforce his rule, Trump has called upon right-wing militias to be an army in his attempts to take absolute power. These groups are still active in 2024. Finally, just as Hitler eroded the norm of mutual respect across different demographics and ignored checks and balances of democratic guardrails, Trump is the most divisive figure in modern American history. He has engaged in personal attacks against judges, lawmakers, and other officials who opposed him, further eroding norms of mutual respect and civility in political discourse. Together, these actions and what he proposes to do if reelected is a full-throated use of the tyrant's roadmap. Now, let's review a tyrant's consequences. Here we will review the results of Hitler's actions, Trump's actions to date, and what could follow if Trump is reelected. The consequences of the Hitler regime are well known and well remembered. A Holocaust led to the systematic murder of approximately 6 million Jews and millions of other persecuted groups. World War II caused approximately 70 to 85 million deaths, including both military and civilian casualties worldwide. And the cost of World War II were around $1.6 trillion. That was in 1945. That's equivalent to $24 trillion today. The persecution of people by the Nazi regime caused a brain drain, as many intellectuals, scientists, and artists and professionals fled Germany, never to be regained. Germany was divided into East Germany and West Germany until 1990, leading to political, economic, and social implications, and the extensive destruction of infrastructure, loss of industrial capacity, and confiscation of assets from persecuted groups contributed to immense financial losses. Now let's look at Trump's consequences between 2015, when he first became president, and 2024. Democratic norms and institutions were eroded, and the effectiveness and respect for democratic institution norms leading to the lowest polity index ratings since the Civil War. This significantly increases the chance of a new civil war, which we'll look at in a following slide. The January 6th insurrection. It further eroded democracy and increased social fragmentation. 7 police officers were dead, 140 injured, thousands of arrests and hundreds of convictions, over 1.5 million for capital repairs, 521 million for National Guard deployment, and additional costs for law enforcement and legal proceedings. The Supreme Court. Due to its stacking actions, decisions removing rights of people in the area of voting rights, affirmative action, and women's medical rights, a court ideology significantly more conservative than the broad American populace, and delays of justice for the January 6th insurrection. And rhetoric and disinformation has caused significant social and political division, reflected in the increase of hate crimes from 5,850 in 2015 to 11,634 in 2022, and with estimated direct cost of $3.4 billion. So what could happen if Trump is reelected 2025 and beyond? Perhaps 2 more conservative justices for SCOTUS and more rights removed. Condone emergence of the white Christian nationalists, resulting in more hate crimes. Increased income and wealth inequality, which creates more social instability. And potentially civil war, or even further, authoritarianism via autocracy. We must now look at the actual possibility that we could enter a second civil war here in the United States. Several initial conditions are already in place. Trump has picked at the weaknesses in American democracy to exacerbate and accelerate the decline of civil behavior and of democratic norms and institutions. This common experience has created the belief among many Americans, 67%, that a civil war could be possible. One report highlights issues such as high levels of political polarization, inequality, cultural and economic divisions, and the prevalence of firearms. It also notes that political rhetoric and actions, particularly claims of election fraud and the activities of private militias, have exacerbated fears of potential conflict. And experts say this would not be like the first Civil War with armies maneuvering on the battlefield. It would be much more like a free-for-all, neighbor on neighbor, based on beliefs and skin colors and religion, and it would be horrific. There are possible triggering events of this occurring. Imagine election results not being accepted. Protesters and counter-protesters gather in many locations. Deadly shots are fired, and the crisis spreads. Another triggering event. Government mandates are rejected by conservative citizens. Government troops and local militia square off in many locations, and local law enforcement may be on either side. Deadly shots are fired, and the crisis spreads. Ethnic and racial tensions explode in one or more locations. Deadly shots are fired, and the crisis spreads. In fact, when you look at the typical risk factors for civil war, which include economic inequality, political instability, public mistrust in institutions, access to weapons, social fragmentation, weak governance, and ethnic and racial tensions, all of them are at extreme risk levels or moving in that direction. We should not consider this a remote possibility, but a real possibility. Finally, we reach our conclusions. America's democracy is deteriorating. America's society is dividing. The Earth's environment is becoming uninhabitable. One presidential candidate continues to act to worsen these conditions: Donald J. Trump. Trump's frequent attacks on the judiciary, media, and electoral systems continue to undermine public trust in democratic institutions. Trump's disregard for democratic norms, including the respect for the rule of law and ethical standards, continue to challenge the foundational principles of democracy. Trump's rhetoric and policies worsen ethnic and racial and political divisions. And these actions embolden white nationalist movements and normalize violent action. Trump's unpredictable foreign policy actions and rhetoric could contribute to global instability and increase tensions with other major powers such as China and Russia. Trump's climate change denial and withdrawal from international climate agreements have undermined global efforts to address environmental issues, exacerbating the impacts of climate change. Also, Trump's rise to power, the tactics followed, and the dark results produced are strikingly like the Adolf Hitler regime. Social and political and economic conditions were exploited and worsened by both to weaken and eventually destroy democracy. There has been horrific consequences produced by Adolf Hitler and Trump actions, including deaths, high costs, and national deterioration. Hitler's tyrannical journey has ended. Will Trump's end in 2024? It is up to you. So, in the shadow of democracy's potential demise, a vote for Trump in 2024 is inviting dire consequences. Instead, make your vote stand as a beacon of hope for the preservation and healing of democracy. If you got to this slide, this is the end. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you find this helpful in making your very important decision about how to vote in 2024. This is a quick bio of the author, Bruce Gritton. It's provided here just to provide background information of my career background, my personal goals in retirement, and recent activities that I've participated in. Hope you find this helpful. Author endnotes. This slide really just provides a quick summary of my background, which you've seen in a previous slide, and the reason why I decided to do this project. I also want to acknowledge ChatGPT and its use as an invaluable research assistant and a statistical data analyst. The following slides are the set of references that were used directly by myself as the author or provided as citable references by ChatGPT in my interactions to try to pursue various threads in this presentation. I hope you all find these references useful in following up to assess the credibility and accuracy of the presentation as it was presented.